I think a great question to ask anytime we get a quote from any company would be, hey, do you see any challenges that could make this go off track? And if so, how would those challenges be
If
from
this
the
were to
client?
go wrong, how
Yeah,
would it go wrong? Oh, I
exactly.
love that question.
Yeah, yeah. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us in another episode of In the Trenches Roundtable. Today's episode is going to be a fun one. Just jump right into it. Today we're going to be talking about comparing quotes. We're going to be talking about comparing the one thing that you seek when you reach out to a security firm or a security company, and that is the proposal. And so imagine you're getting a camera system installed and you are getting multiple bids, or you have to get multiple bids. Many times these bids will be very, very different. And how do you even know how to compare them to make sure that you're making the right decision? And so I've got my awesome expert panel here with me. Say hey, everyone.
Hey,
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 everyone.
everyone.
Heck yes. They all listened. Look at that. I've rarely, I think never actually, have gotten everyone to say hey, everyone. So that's great. Appreciate that. Told you this was going to be a fun one today. Awesome.
Yeah,
To
I
help.
can end this really quick, Ben.
Yeah?
Lowest price. We're done.
It,
out the door.
sign
I'm going
off.
to throw my coffee cup at the screen right now.
Mic drop. And if we follow that practice, Gil and Cal will be out of their job. So thank you.
Yep.
And No, for real though, I would like to set the table a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today and more so create some structure to help us walk through this rather complex and really difficult process. So today we're going to start and break down the episode like this. We're going to start with section 1, which we're going to be comparing the equipment. And then the second section we'll be comparing the actual quoting process. Then we'll move on to the third section, which will be the scope of work and assumptions. And then the final section we'll leave with are some questions for you to ask the company you're choosing to work with. Cool. So like I said, we're going to start with comparing equipment. That's usually what most people think of when they compare quotes. And let's just face it. There's so much more than the actual equipment when we compare equipment, right? And there's even more to the comparing equipment parts. So does anyone want to start and kind of walk us through what this might look like and some things we should consider?
I feel like what it looks like varies a lot. Like you'll get quotations that are very specific, this camera with these specifications, this resolution, et cetera. And you'll get ones that'll just say IP camera 8. And that's it. And I've seen a lot of quotes that look like that.
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right.
So my first thought is that, making sure if you're comparing 8 cameras to 8 cameras is important. That great check mark. But also, what are the details? What are the specifics of those cameras matter? I see a lot of quotes that don't specify whose cameras they are. So it says just IP camera, but you don't know if that is that a Hikvision OEM, is it that Dahua OEM? And if you're sort of a little deeper into the industry, you know that there's a lot of instability around some of those manufacturers, around being able to warranty it and support it long term. And a lot of that equipment's gotten dumped in the last couple of years, which means it can be likely to show up on these quotes at heavily discounted rates. So it looks like a good deal, but given the context, it's actually not.
Yeah, that's a good point. So camera quality is definitely something to consider, right? I think if we were to start labeling some of these things, camera quality would be up at the top of the list. Like,
That's huge. I mean, they're not even gonna, unless they're in the industry or they read specifications about cameras and look at ratings, they're not gonna know what's better than another. And there are definitely differences in reliability and value. And apples to apples, as far as specifications, don't necessarily mean the cameras are equal in capability and or longevity.
yeah, that's a really good point.
Lots to think about.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
like, as you
having to ask.
mentioned,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I mean, yeah, you mentioned earlier. I mean, you see a lot of quotes that just say IP bullet camera, but I mean, that doesn't really tell you what the camera is going to do for you. There's so many different types of IP bullet cameras. Like, is it a varifocal lens camera? Like, what's the megapixel count? I mean, that's one thing that our quotes that I really like about our quotes, that really just lists out the camera specs, what they do, their purposes. That's something you should definitely look for.
And to piggyback off what Cal's saying, I think that's such a good point too. Like our quotes even outline, some of the facial recognition range of the cameras, right? Like some contextual specifications to go along with the camera too, right? Because what does 2 megapixel IP camera mean if you're not in the industry, And if you're not having the conversation about it, yeah, that's a really good point.
And
Yeah.
if you
And
haven't had the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just think there's an appropriate time to quote a 2 megapixel camera. If you've got a
Absolutely.
10 by 10 room, there's no reason to spend money on a 4K camera. But the context matters.
And that's why it's important to have that discussion about each individual camera placement and what they are doing. If you're not having that discussion and just saying, I need 8 cameras, here's the locations. They don't know what they're looking at. They're just going to sell you the lowest cost camera and try to make as much money as possible.
Right.
Or each camera could require a different type of camera for the different field of view and the type of detail they're wanting to get,
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I think that kind of moves us into that next, bullet point for me.
Can I add one more detail on the equipment side, just really fast?
No, yeah, we're staying on equipment, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I thought we were moving on.
No, I was just going to change over to quantity. Like, how do we even know the right number of cameras too, right? Like, that's something we should definitely be comparing.
And I have definitely had folks come back and say, you are 10K over the next competing bid, and I get the details, and I'm like, and their bid is 17 cameras fewer. These are not the quantity is not apples to apples, let alone the other details. What I was going to say about equipment is it doesn't just stop with like the camera and the NVR and those core components. You also need to look at switches and infrastructure, racks, all those ancillary pieces that are important to the installation. It doesn't mean you can't say, I don't need a rack, put it on a shelf, but you do need it. That's going to impact the cost and impact your comparison. So reading those details matters.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. Gail, Cal, you have a ton of experience in the industry, looking at different quotes of different companies and stuff. Have you seen examples of quotes out there that don't list those products, like those auxiliary products that are required, but sometimes maybe aren't listed out as a line item?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen quotes that are a little bit more vague, that don't necessarily list everything when it comes down. I mean, a lot of quotes, if big pieces of equipment like power supplies and like cabinets and stuff like that, a lot of those are listed, but a lot of that stuff is assumed sometimes too, like depending on the type of building or the environment that you're installing in. So you're definitely going to want to like really go through each item and kind of see where it's going to be installed and how it's going to play out, and like the totality of your system once it's installed, based on the quote that you receive. And definitely talk to the people that are providing the quote to you about, what is all this equipment? Where is it going to go? What role does it play? If they're not willing to answer that, then that's a whole other, bag of worms that you're going to have to deal with.
Definitely. I'd say too that, Cal and Gil, you both kind of covered it right here just a minute ago, but we definitely pay attention to, the miscellaneous sections. Some quotes, depending on the size from some companies, have baked in things like rack, head-end equipment, right? That's something that's just going to automatically be on the quote unless the client requests it not be, right? So maybe you already have a rack in place and you don't need a new rack, right? Or
that's another thing too that shows up on quotes a lot too. If you look through, sometimes it does on ours, but like the word custom product, if you see that, definitely ask about, what that is. I mean, a lot of times it's a product that, the company that's providing the quote, has to source elsewhere. But sometimes on the quote, when you get it, it'll just show up as like custom product. So definitely something to be on the lookout for too.
Awesome. That's good. And so one final piece on equipment before we move on. What about things like conduit and like cabling? Because those are physical materials.
Yeah, so the cable question comes up a lot. Should that be on the quote? Should we announce how many reels or how many boxes we're actually going to purchase for the job versus just know that the installation number includes whatever amount of cable is required? Conduit is a different thing.
Exactly.
Cal can probably talk to conduit better than anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is something you want light on, just so you know what to expect and kind of how much you're going to see on the outside of your building, the outside of your structure. Because if you get a quote and it says 100 feet of EMT, and you're looking at your job after it's done, and you only see maybe 2 stalks worth or 20 feet worth of EMT, then they're keeping that extra 80 feet.
Well, and
And
when
market price too, like it does fluctuate. The cost of the material too does fluctuate. So
and for us, when we say line item there, though, we typically combine the material and the labor. We're just sort of like, we are delivering to you 100 installed feet of conduit because that's what's required to do this, appropriately to code or whatnot. We're not saying here's a price for your 10 stalks of EMT and here's your labor typically. And that's sort of for a similar reason, because if you're installing 100 feet of conduit, you need all kinds of different combinations of parts depending on what that run looks like. You're going to need different lengths. You're going to need different connectors. You're going to need, the variables will change.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't really help you compare as a client, I think, to tell you I'm going to use 6 of these connectors and 12 of those connectors and 5 of these stalks. And here's why I need 5 stalks because I got to bend it in this kind of way.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that wraps up the equipment. Again, we started with equipment because that is definitely the most common thing people think of when they think of comparing proposals. But there's a lot more that goes into it. We covered some of it there, but we're about to get into the section 2, which is companies and process and what that might look like. So evaluating or comparing the quoting process and the company you're working with. To me, this is absolutely 100% the most important part when comparing quotes. And in fact, before you even seek proposals, I believe you should be doing this part, which is comparing and vetting the quoting process and companies you're working with. So with that being said, I'd love to get anyone else's opinions or thoughts now.
I agree. I kind of want to bounce it back to you, Ben, and talk about, because we're very enmeshed in our process. Obviously, I believe very strongly that it is the best way to approach getting the job done in a way that's going to create consistent, high quality results and be efficient and scalable. I got banned from using the word efficient at one point, so I like cringe every time I say it. But I feel like you have a little more, Ben. You're talking to folks day in and day out who are not enmeshed in our process and have all kinds of other frameworks and expectations when they call. So how do you talk to them about how to engage with us and how to evaluate process?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I think for me, it's trying to do or understand education level and provide education if there's the understanding that maybe the client might not be so familiar with how the industry operates, right? Because there's 2 things at play here. There's the way that SCW operates within this industry, and then there's the way the industry operates. I think that's a fair statement. And traditionally, and Gil, Kyle, I'd love your help here, but traditionally when you pick up the phone and ask a security company for a quote for install, they're rolling a truck and getting somebody on site almost immediately or as quickly as they can. Pretty common practice, like just about
absolutely,
everywhere.
as quickly as they can, and they are going to.
And we started that way.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We used to do that a while ago, and it just kind of it wastes not only our time and resources, it wastes the client's time and resources too. Because if you're just rolling somebody out to walk the site and not get a whole lot of customer input and provide you with a quote really quickly, it's pretty telling that it's not going to be kind of a tailored custom quote to exactly what you need, because all of that legwork and conversations prior to the site survey aren't happening. So you're not really hearing the customer's needs. You're not really understanding the site's needs. You're just trusting that the person doing the site survey or the walkthrough, knows their stuff and is going to give you the best, quote for your job.
And you're not really approaching the walkthrough with a plan. You're sort of showing up on site and you're trying to get all that information and put together a plan and physically evaluate the realities of the building almost at the same time, instead of breaking those pieces apart and sort of saying, okay, what are we trying to do? where should we be putting these cameras? What are the goals? And then evaluating the physical realities of the building, which is actually what you're trying to do at a site survey, is how am I going to get the cable from this place to this place? But if you haven't defined this place and why those places matter before you start defining that pathway, the locations end up shifting and being fluid, like on the ground, and then remembering and documenting that after the fact. Some people are great at it. Some people are not so great at it. More people are not so great at it than great at it. So this is kind of where we ended up with, like, okay, we want to start with a plan before boots get on the ground. And that way we're really isolating what the goals are of each step and making sure that each step is accomplished well and efficiently. Again, I said efficient.
Mhm. No, absolutely.
Different companies do this different ways, though. So, in my opinion, and there's variations of all three of these, but you have a smaller company where you're just generally going to have probably either the owner or someone, you know, like that coming out, one man bandish, or they wear lots of hats, right? So they're not just the sales guy, they're the order taker, they're the service guy. They do a little bit of everything. So that's the guy that's, you know, going to be coming out to talk to you about your quote. Really busy all over the place, lots of things going on, got projects they're trying to get completed, billing, lots of stuff on their mind, right? Then you have the medium-sized companies, which might have some sales staff, you know, might have an executive or two or something, people that will actually go out, you know, get assigned the job and go out and talk to you, you know, and not always are they hitting up the people that are going to be doing the work, so they're informed, you know, of, you know, what it's going to take to install certain cable runs and cameras and stuff like that. They're just going to go out and talk to you and, you know, take down what you want and then go back and figure out a quote. Then you have your large companies, which have estimators, you know what I mean, have sales teams, they have staff, they're educated in actual site surveying, and will actually really dig down in detail and get into it, but it's going to cost, you know. So those are the, you know, and like I said, there's variations of all that. How do you know what you're getting, and how do you know what to decipher for if you're just Googling up security camera installation for your area? How do you know what you're getting, who those companies are, ratings, reviews? I don't, you know, there's so much to it in selecting. You know, it's just stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. It's definitely tough, and that's why I say, you know, I'll circle the entire wheel back to Micah's first, you know, turnaround of the question and say that's where I like to start is why'd you Google search security camera installations in your area? That's where you need to start, right? Why are you getting cameras? Is it because
you're having that conversation, you know?
Right, exactly. You have to break it down to its most simplest form to truly understand. Like, you might believe that cameras is the best bet for you to monitor the people coming and going from your property, but what if it's actually access control?
Right.
You're going to find that out on a consultation with a security consultant, not on site with the guy who usually is installing cameras.
Right.
Right.
You really need to take a step back and evaluate, like, what's the end goal here? And if you're the person that's tasked with going to get these quotes, then you need to turn around to the people that asked you to go get these quotes and ask them what's important. Is it just getting quotes, or is it getting quotes at accurate pricing, getting true apple quotes, getting a true partner, right? There's all these questions that should be
Quotes
answered.
that actually reflect our needs.
Exactly. 100%.
Yeah, because I mean, we do get that. Like, my boss asked me to get a quote. I just need a quote for 8 cameras, and we're like, I mean, we can give you a rough quote for 8 cameras, but when it comes time to actually install those cameras, all these questions are going to come back up. Like, why is that camera there? And then it gets moved, and then you incur more costs, and it gets much more convoluted and difficult and frustrating to manage.
And that's why we value the consultation process so much. That's why, like, we on our side of the house value the consultation process so much. You know, not to say that there can't be changes throughout the process, through the survey process, or even the installation process. Like, you're gonna run into, you know, change orders and stuff like that. It's inevitable. But you know, a lot of that can be avoided, you know, by doing what Ben's talking about through the consultation process. If you know why you're getting the cameras installed, what purpose these cameras need to serve before we even get out there, it just makes the survey process and ultimately the installation process so much easier, and it works out so much better for the client, I find.
Yeah, if they don't have that discussion, they think it's cookie cutter. You know, we're in an information overload society, right? So they're at Walmart and Sam's Club, and all these places have 8 camera systems. There, it's in a box. Grab the box and go install it. Every camera will work for every situation, right? No.
Not well. It might work, just not well.
Good point.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where consultation, I think, is really important.
So important. So important, right? And also the consultation will help answer a lot of the things, a lot of the questions that we were talking about that might surface from comparing the equipment on quotes if you don't properly evaluate the process that you're going for through to get that quote. Meaning, if you understand why you're choosing to put this resolution camera in this given scenario because you went through consultation, then there's no reason for you to question why is there two megapixel cameras on your equipment list, right?
Right.
It makes the actual sitting down comparing the price of the quotes much more achievable in a meaningful way, right? Because there's nothing worse from a client's perspective than going through and collecting your bids to only go back and collect more bids. You know, and that's going to slowly start transitioning us to our next section, which is scope of work and assumptions. But Cal, we are working on that.
Real quick though, Ben, can we throw in a discussion real quick about how our support is having that discussion about support and warranty?
Oh, it's huge. And that goes into the evaluating of the company. Yeah, absolutely.
Big. I mean,
and even connects back to that earlier conversation about like what cameras are on there, whose cameras are they? When you've got, you know, these smaller, especially these smaller and medium-sized companies that are just selling you anybody's cameras, when that camera breaks, you're calling that guy, he's coming out, he might be trying to fix it, maybe it's DOA. He's getting on the phone with whoever he bought it from. And what's his relationship with them like? You know, does he have a good relationship where they're going to back him up? They're going to get that equipment out and they're going to
I can tell you what it is in a lot of cases. It's just him calling some nondescript tech support line for the camera company he bought. He doesn't know anyone there. They don't know him.
Yep.
And that's just the way it is.
And if he's not a certified installer, if he doesn't have a whole lot of experience installing that brand cameras, then he has to jump through even more hoops to reach their tech support to get to the eventual RMA process. And it's just, it's a whole
elongates those service calls and makes them a little more difficult.
Not to mention you're paying for that person to be doing this the entire time anyway.
Yep, you're paying for that person to sit on the phone with another person for another company, and it's just eating everybody's money and it's wasting everybody's time.
Absolutely. So that's why like evaluating the warranty of the product, understanding what and who the product is coming from. Absolutely, right? And support policies that go along with it.
That's another way that I think we're really distinct because it is our cameras that we're installing. It's our tech support team. There's a priority line that the technician can call where they're getting to our team, and that relationship is there. And we know what our replacement policies are. We know that if that camera appears to have a manufacturer defect or for some reason just didn't work on site, sometimes it's just because somebody electrocuted it. But anyway,
check out our search protection video in the description below.
Other conversation. We know that we're gonna do what we call an advanced replacement, where we go ahead and ship you a replacement immediately, and not wait for that DOA or defective camera to come back, and that saves folks so much time.
A lot of companies don't do advanced replacements. That's like an whole extra charge and everything, and a whole rigmarole. I can tell you that. Most cameras are purchased through distribution. So then you're throwing in another party to hit. For individuals out there, they're not just dealing with the manufacturer on the tech support side. They're dealing with the RMA process through the distributor to get the camera. So you have to talk to the manufacturer to get their RMA, to give the distributor to get their RMA to get the camera replaced.
Right. And what that means for the customer is just
Time.
more time that you don't have a functioning camera system.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. No,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
also feel like that's where like the nondescript, like it's not identified who makes this camera, make me really, really nervous. That's not to say if it says, X brand that you might still be buying through a distributor and still have that extended time. But when they don't even tell you who they're buying from, that makes me feel like they're buying from lots of different people for any given job and they don't have established relationships and process, and that support situation is going to be a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
They're just
Yeah.
Those
giving you what
little
they have
flyers
to
go out every month, and I can guarantee half of the installation companies in this country go by those flyers. They're like,
Hmm.
okay, the deal of the month is this brand and this camera. That's what I'm going to sell this month.
Mhm.
There is.
I believe you.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I'm glad we circled back to it because I think there's other contextual things that go along with comparing and vetting companies in the process too. Like even things like, are the reps responding to me in a timely manner? Am I
Mhm.
getting
Big.
involvement from other parties? Right. I think that's
Yeah.
important, right? Some of
Yeah.
these
Mhm.
organizations who can do consultations before a site visit, have resources like sales engineers, project managers,
Right.
installation technicians, that we
Mhm.
have
Mhm.
the ability to, afford more value initially than others might. So,
Right.
anything else on companies and process before we move on?
Nailed it.
I think it's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's good. We can
I
put a
love
check
that
mark.
show.
Nailed it. Absolutely. All right, and so we'll transition over to scope of work and assumptions, and this kind of goes hand in hand with comparing like the process a little bit, and the equipment, right? So this is kind of tying the last two sections we talked to together in a sense, at least in the way that I view it, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Because from my experience with a lot of the clients I have worked with that are comparing quotes, we are one of few companies who provide a scope of work document during the quoting process.
Mm.
Scope of work's interesting because we used to do, and Cal could probably attest to this too. Our scope of work was more like a paragraph. It was more like
Yes,
Yeah.
it was
that's
a
what I've seen.
description. Like,
Yeah.
like a written out, we're doing this, 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 this,
Yeah.
this, and this. And then you had your exclusions or your assumptions. That was it. Ours is a little different. I like it because it shows it more.
Mhm.
Mm.
But those are things you got to compare because you're going to see different
Mhm.
scopes of work or lots of quotes, no scopes of work at all.
Yeah. Well, let's back up for a second and define scope of work. It's just sort of a general term to describe what is going to be accomplished for this exchange of money, essentially. And the details get really important because you can have 8 identical cameras and all identical equipment, but if they're going in completely different locations, the cost, the labor is going to be very, very different. So making sure that everybody's on the same page about where things are going and why, and that scope of work captures that is really important.
Yep. Yeah, Mike. I mean, you make a really great point too. I think understanding the scope of work is important from the client's perspective because this is your ability to have accountability for all of the time and
Mhm.
effort you just put in to get to this place, to get to a quote,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
This is you saying, hey, when we walked around on site and you said we're going to install this camera in this location, here's it laid out on paper,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
And for us, and honestly, sometimes we struggle getting our points of contact to execute on these steps. But part of our process also involves like when it comes time to do the work, reviewing the scope of work again. So you've accepted a bid, you signed it off, you've paid us some money, you've signed a contract. Now somebody's there, present, ready to start the work, and we do another review. That's where I'm putting the camera. That's where I'm putting the camera. It's everybody on the same page because the details can get lost pretty easily. A lot of times there's multiple parties involved, and having those frequent checks about, again, are we all on the same page is a difference between people being happy at the end and people not being happy at the end.
Yeah.
Right.
What,
I mean, even
Gil?
take that extra step towards the end. When we start an install, we do the location approval form. So the client agrees on all the locations that's included in the scope of work. And at the end of the work, we do a view approval form. So that basically the client signs off that the scope of work has been completed and they're happy with the camera's location and its field of view. That's something that I've never really seen any other companies do. So just above and beyond.
It's taken some work to train all parties involved.
Right. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get the customers to agree to take that extra time to walk through the site multiple times and go over it with the tech. But we definitely find that it cuts down on all the
Wow, that's such.
Confusion.
I
Yeah.
was just gonna say that's such a good point. Like, in Cal and Gil, in your experience, what would happen in that case if you didn't have a sign off on the view after the camera's installed, and then you had to go back out and fix it, right? That's more money, it's more time.
Yeah, I mean, you end up in this push-pull about, well, was it right to begin with? Or and we're having to spend more time, somebody has to spend more time to come back out and do work again. So we really should be billing for that. And it creates this tension in the relationship. Either somebody's paying money that they didn't want to be paying, or somebody feels like they're spending money on labor that they don't want to be spending.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare.
It's not fun.
It's okay. So scope of work is for the benefit of both parties.
Mm.
So it covers us also, but it covers the client too. That's why it has to be understood up front. And
Yeah,
what Cal's saying is so true. Getting the understood requirements, before actually starting the installation, finding out that everything is agreed to per the scope of work. A lot of companies don't do that. I mean, my old company didn't do that, and they were pretty big. We did the after stuff. We made sure people signed off on the views and stuff like that.
Sure.
But the before stuff, no, it's just like, here's the scope of work. We're gonna get rocking. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And hope this was a great. Usually, the guys that are going to be on site typically are not the guys that have those discussions.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Barely
you
ever.
know what I mean? So they're just
Yeah.
they're going out and they're going to do what the account executive and the project manager says to do. This is what we tell you to do. Go do it, right? So when they do that, and then the client comes up and says, "I didn't say to do that like that." That's what that scope of work's in place for.
Right.
Well, it also covers the technician too. Just me being a former technician, I have to speak for them too, because sometimes we'll have clients that'll just hover over technicians and kind of like get them to do stuff that wasn't in the scope of work.
Oh, absolutely,
all the time, but it does happen quite a bit. So it definitely helps.
That's a big one, Cal.
Yeah,
that happens a lot.
From experience, I can say it does all the time.
I know you, dear viewer, would not do this, but
no.
Yeah,
Nobody's watching this video, but
no, absolutely.
It does happen.
But no, I think scope of work, having a defined scope of work, having it reviewed for both parties, right? Like Gil said, it covers everybody. Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point.
And then that leads right into the assumptions.
I was just gonna say
we used to, well, there's exclusions, but I think we like to use the term assumptions. They're different but the same. You know what I mean? But it's important because it really clarifies who's doing what and who's not doing what.
Yeah, Micah, would you want to give us an official definition of assumptions?
Of assumptions,
Yeah.
the foundation on which this quote is built, in a sense. This is how we understand the lay of the land, and if one of these things is not true, we'll have to stop and look at the quote again. Doesn't mean that we don't move forward. Sometimes there's a change order, sometimes there's an adjustment, but it creates that clarity. So like a lot of times we're not able to do electrical work. So, or high voltage electrical work, technically it's low voltage. So things like there will be a place to plug the NVR in, avoids us, technicians showing up and being like, here is the NVR, I need to plug it in, and there not being an outlet. Those kinds of details. So they're not meant as gotchas. They're meant as just making sure everybody's really clear about the mutual responsibilities, where one ends, where one begins, so that we can have a successful project.
Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I just love, I'm gonna coin that. Like, it's not meant as a gotcha. And if
Right.
you feel that way
Mm.
when you read an assumption, you probably didn't have a great consultation, and you should
Ooh.
reevaluate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Point. But they're necessary. Sorry,
No,
Mr. Customer.
Mm-hmm.
they're absolutely necessary, but that's the importance of
Yeah.
the process and why you should be evaluating the process to get to a quote, because
Mm-hmm.
assumptions only come with a quote, and you should be totally prepared for any assumption that comes along with the quote, because you had the
Mm-hmm.
consultation with the executive to comprise that plan, right? This is
Yeah.
a co-built plan. Um,
A lot of conflict in relationships, business or otherwise, it comes from unspoken expectations. And so having assumptions clearly delineated is a way of making sure that all the expectations are spoken and clear, because we all have expectations. You have expectations as a client, that technician has expectations, the account executive has expectations. And when they don't get communicated, it creates opportunity for friction. And that's just what we're trying to always tackle and avoid.
Right. It sets boundaries. It lets you know that like these boundaries, this is what the technician is going to do. Like these are my boundaries. This is what I'm responsible for. This is what you're responsible for. You know, being your site. You know, you're responsible for having these things in place that we talked about during the site survey and the consultation process. I mean, it just establishes boundaries.
Yeah, that's perfect right there. What he just said, because we're not going to install their network. We're not going to install their internet. We're not going to install their electrical. We're not, there's a lot of stuff we're not going to do, but have to have in place so our system ties into it, works properly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, like everyone said, yeah, just having it defined there helps mitigate a lot of the, perceived issues that could come down the road if it's not there. Right. And I think that's the next place I want to take. If there's nothing else, you should walk away from this little section here of scope of work and assumptions, is how important it is, this section, scope of work, and defining it, understanding it, how important that is to getting the solution you desire implemented, right? So you can comprise and get a quote for a solution, and if there's not a good scope of work outlined and you don't agree to it and it's not defined, the assumptions don't exist, that quote that you're in love with, that you so greatly need and want, might not ever actually get implemented or implemented in a way for you to even use it, right? So many things could come up during the installation process. So many things could change. How many COs get done on projects where scope of works aren't defined? Happens all the time. There's companies out there that build their business off of doing COs.
Oh, that's a good point. That's something that should be mentioned here, that sometimes they'll get the quote back that will be low, but it's based on the company assuming that there's going to be changes, and they're going to get you for a change order on that so they can increase their profit on the job.
Right.
The less detail you have defined going in, the greater the margin of error and your exposure to change orders. And again, they happen. It's not to say that a change order or two is inappropriate or not great, but they come with a cost. Like you are going to, if there's a change order, the likelihood is that means there's an additional cost. So you do want to, where you can control those variables by having good conversations ahead of time and having a good plan and a well-defined scope of work, it is in your interest to do that.
That cuts down on the change orders immensely. And yes, it is the customer that pays for a change order.
Right. Absolutely. But I think that, everything that was just said right there is even exponentially more felt from a pre-construction project, a project that is in the construction process. Yes. Right, Gil? We see this way too much.
Yes. Yeah. It's that times 100. You know what I mean? It's, there's so much more detail involved, so much more variables, so much more that you can't foresee, as much as they try in construction projects to get as much upfront as possible clearly defined. It's rarely the case, because stuff happens, right? Stuff happens all the time on a project site that will affect things, that will change things, that they didn't account for. There's so many little details that need to be accounted for that are hard to see when you don't have it right in front of you. That when you get on site and start working on it, you realize, okay, that's something I need or something the customer needs. That's when the changes come. So yeah, construction jobs are kind of, probably you should pull that to the side a little bit from our discussion and say there's a little bit more to it.
Yeah, definitely. No, absolutely. Heck yeah. Scope of work and assumptions, they're important. Very important. And that'll wrap that section up. Absolutely. And we'll just transition that right into the final section, section 4, which is questions to ask. You know, what are some questions initially or generally speaking that we should be thinking of or could seek to ask when we compare quotes?
You're talking about the client, right? What do you think?
Yeah, if I'm a
they should ask
client and I'm looking
us?
at quotes, yeah, what kind of questions should I be thinking of or asking?
Well, I want to bounce that back to you, buddy. I mean, what do
Definitely.
you get? What do you hear?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think it's a lot of some of the sections that we just covered, right? But more importantly, it's going to be a lot of the time, hey, can you help me explain what this, I don't know, what do we call them? Like when we add a lift, what do we call that? Other services?
Other services,
There
yeah.
we go.
Yeah.
Or yeah, other assumptions, right? So I think like a lot of the quote questions that I get around our proposals are around those defined other services or assumptions. So
Mhm.
Right.
things like lifts or maybe high voltage electrical work or yeah, needing some
Yeah.
other trade to do
Conduit
work.
goes in there. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
All the extra stuff that has a definitive cost to it that needs to be included.
Mhm.
Right. I'd say a
Yeah.
majority of the questions I've seen come from that section on our proposals. Separate from that though, I think, you know, because of the way that we do quoting for this type of work, a lot of the questions that get asked to us are about another company's quote compared to ours. Hey, can you help me
Right.
comprehend this? And they look so different. So it's a lot of questions like that. But yeah, I think I just point back to equipment as being the first one. A lot of people try to use the terms apples to apples, and I don't know. It's
Right.
you really need to know this space to understand if it's truly apples to apples or not.
Yeah. Like, do you ever go through the quote that they have from another company and look at the specifications on cameras and stuff that they're getting and show them the differences?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I've actually even had the opportunity to do a Zoom call and was able to like Google, model numbers and show them.
Right.
Okay, this is the
Yeah.
actual
Like,
camera
let's
for
look
them.
at this. Let's look at this together.
Absolutely.
That help? It's got to help, right?
Oh, it helps a ton. It helps
That
a
was
ton.
cathartic.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
No, it helps a ton. I just, those are the clients who genuinely understand our process, the benefits from our process, why it's different, all of that, right? Getting the people who might not understand our stuff and might just want that quote, oh, I just need that third quote.
Right.
Those are the people who it's a little bit more difficult to reason. Like,
Some of that reflects time too. Like if I don't have, like I'm thinking about myself when I'm in a purchasing role, sometimes I don't have the emotional bandwidth, I don't have the time, the mental bandwidth to honestly ask all of those detailed questions.
Mhm.
And I honestly, at that point, I end up making gut calls based on my experience. When you spoke to me and I did ask questions, did you give me a cogent answer? Do I feel like you're being transparent and clear, even if I'm not getting into the nitty gritty of every single camera detail? Is there coherence? Is there professionalism? Are there details? Or do I feel like I'm being just fed a bunch of vagueness? For me, not having the time to go line by line by line over 5 different quotes, I would probably end up just immediately trashing the quotes that were very vague because that vagueness could work in my favor, but it also might not. And I don't have time to risk that. I would rather pay a little bit more to work with an operation that is going to give me details when I ask for them.
Yeah. That's really good insight.
Yeah.
That's really good insight. And in that moment, when you feel like you don't have the time, you trash the ones that are vague, but you would be willing to pay a little bit more to understand that it's thorough, right? That you can trust it once you do sign on it. What other considerations would you have in those moments? Like, say you had a couple quotes that were close in price, that were all thorough. Where would you turn to next? And it would really be that sentiment towards like the process and
Probably the sentiment towards the process and the experience. Because if on the sales process you consistently communicate with me, it doesn't mean that, you know, things don't get delayed or there aren't obstacles, but you've communicated with me about those obstacles throughout. Because I'm realistic. I work with services teams. I know how complicated, labor is. So I get that. But I also know you can control how you communicate with me about it. And that's what I'm going to kind of evaluate an entity on and take to heart. The other thing I'm probably going to look at is that sort of, I think, what they call social proof. I'm going to be looking at, what are the reviews? How do people talk about the company? What's that experience like? And given, if it's in any given field, if I am not an expert, I have to rely on what I am good at, which I think is reading people and understanding process, and what I can access, which is sort of that crowdsourced, is this a reputable company piece of information? And that's really hard when you're dealing with smaller shops. Because they could be great, honestly. A lot of them are very skilled technicians who do very good work. But when you're a small shop, you don't have much information to go on in terms of like online presence or crowdsourcing opinions in a sense.
right.
If I'm a customer, the website has a big deal to do with it for me.
Yeah.
I've seen, because I've gone shopping and looked at companies. I've seen some, you can tell if they're just really small or not that vested into it and don't offer too much information. To me, that's something that's kind of big. I look for.
Well, I think a lot of what you both just said too, usually is a direct reflection of how the install is going to go, and B, how it's going to be supported down the line. If it's if you feel like you can trust the person, you're getting all the information up front. If they seem reputable, if they seem and knowledgeable, usually the install is going to go a lot better. It's going to be more up to your expectation, and usually it's going to be supported a lot better after the install too.
Like, we have our phone number right on the front page, right at the top. I've had to dig so deep to find a phone number on so many people's website. It's amazing.
No, it's so true. It's absolutely true. That's really, really, really good insight. I also think other questions or considerations, maybe not questions, but considerations, should be things like Micah mentioned a little bit about the reviews and just kind of like, the crowdsource ability. References might be a good idea, depending on the size of the project or the organization maybe that you're with. I think a great question to ask anytime we get a quote from any company would be client asking the company, hey, do you see any challenges that could make this go off track? And if so, how would those challenges be?
All right.
It's a great question. I was asked that several months ago.
If this were to go wrong, how would it go wrong?
Exactly,
I love that question.
Yeah. It was I was never asked that in that context before. Yeah, it was great. So I like that question. I think that's a good question to ask.
Because your ability to answer that tells you your understanding of the site, your understanding of the project, your understanding of the risks, how you've evaluated those risks when you've put that quote together. Have I just given you a really high number because I don't actually want to evaluate the risks, or have I put some thought into it and given you, a measured bid?
What was your answer?
Good luck. Just kidding. No.
Your answer is going to be highly specific to that particular project.
Yes.
And your ability to respond with specificity to that particular project would tell the client a lot about your understanding of the site, your understanding of the scope of work, and that it sort of removes the opportunity for vagary.
In this very specific case, it was on a pre-construction project. It was that recycling company. Just reassured them, the level of detail that we were already going in, and then that would just be, continued forth. And they definitely understood that and felt that.
Very good.
Cool.
Awesome. So that'll wrap that up. Really appreciate it. We just covered the 4 sections of how we would look at comparing proposals and quotes and some things that you should be considering when you do so yourselves. Of course, any resources or documentations or videos that we've referenced will be in the description below, so be sure to check those out. So will all of our contact information. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, concerns, even if you're vetting or trying to source the company you're working with. Would love to help in any capacity. Thanks again to the panel of experts, rather. Really appreciate it. Thanks, 2023. Excited for it.
Here we go.
That's it.
Let's go.
Let's
Let's go.